the sixth of our fall sessions. We invite newcomers to our parish periodically, and Vincent tells me that there is a significant group table back there of newcomers, and I would love to ask you to stand. We'll not ask you to introduce yourself, but we'd just like to know where you are and give you a round of applause. If you are a newcomer, if you would stand, we're so happy to have you tonight. And I would like for you who are members to make note of where they are, and let's be sure to encompass them in our hospitality. 2-3 quick things before we get into our program tonight. First of all, remember this coming Saturday night is when the time changes. We go off of daylight saving, and they finally taught me that you spring forward in the spring and you fall backwards in the fall, so you gain an hour. That means you don't have quite as much an excuse. There's no ball games here in town this weekend, and you have an extra hour. So remember to turn your clock back. We always have people come in at the old time, and I just like to alert you to be alert to that. Second thing is I want to begin next Tuesday, next Wednesday. I want to offer a 4 weeks grief support group. This is something I've done many times. Given my own life story, I feel very drawn to try to be of some comfort to people who've gone through experiences of loss. And so I have found in the past that there are people who can come in the afternoon and can't come at night, and there are other people who work, can't come in the afternoon but can. So I'm going to do it on a 2-tier basis this time. Tuesday afternoon 3 to 4:30, I'll be in the Tilson room, and then beginning next Wednesday night after this from 7:45 to 9:15, be in the same place. And let me just say quickly that this is a very gentle process. You're not put on the spot. You don't have to talk. I have learned that about 30 days after a significant grief, most everybody else is finished with it. They were not that involved with the person. And about the time it's really hitting the person who's experienced profound grief of all that they have lost, it's about the time everybody else is expecting them to be back to normal, and it doesn't happen that quickly. So what I try to do is to offer a patient place where the river of grief is not pushed, where you're not told you should or ought to feel certain things, a gentle place to unpack your heart and to talk about whatever it is that might begin to bring healing. This is not a teaching. It's not going to be a lecture. I try to say to folk when we come to these that we can't help in times of grief but try to understand. We can't help but ask, why did this happen? But you know as well as I do, if you've been in grief, that if we had a chart on the wall that answered every intellectual question that we might have, if we had a crystal clear understanding of exactly why the event happened, we would still have to find a way to live with the empty chair at the breakfast room table. The courage to pick up life that is now so different is very different than just having lots of intellectual answers. So our goal is to try to give each other the encouragement to be able to do that work of coming back to the way it is, which is so different from the way it was. And if you have gone through grief, or if you know someone who has gone through grief, I'd be so happy for you to let this be known. It will go for 5 weeks, and beginning next Tuesday and next Wednesday. I always write on the board the first time that you alone can do your grief work, but you don't have to do it alone. In other words, nobody can do this for you, but there is great, great strength sometimes in finding you're not alone, that you're not abnormal, that there are others who are in it with you. So if that's something you'd like to do, please know I'm going to offer that as we move toward the holidays. The great thing we have before us right now at St. Luke's is our Flower Festival. You see all the wonderful greenery here, which is a reminder. And Carol Pointer has been the general chairman of this wonderful event that Alta Guild's been working on now for 2 years. And both as a way of thanking her in advance for all that has been done, and also giving her a chance to tell you a little bit about it. I've asked Carol if she would come and just say a few words. Carol, I do salute you for all that you've done and all your colleagues have done, and I thank you so much.
Thank you, John. In all of Christendom, there is not a church whose windows are adorned with Christian symbols made entirely out of dried flowers, plus a flower carpet, plus fresh flower arrangements throughout the church. You have to see it to believe it. It is truly magnificent. Peggy Ragland is going to have tickets afterwards for a mere $10, which includes tea. You can come to an open house Friday afternoon, Saturday afternoon, and Sunday afternoon. And when the rest of Birmingham is talking about what a fabulous job St. Luke's Flower Festival was, do you want to say, boy, wasn't that terrific, and join in talking about the memories, or do you want to say, oh, I'm sick, I did not go to that? So buy a ticket, bring your friends and neighbors, and just please come. It's really great.
I have been watching as they've been putting this up, and it is extraordinary. There's a tent out in the courtyard, and it's going to be a lovely, lovely weekend, and I hope you will take advantage of that. Again, we welcome all of you to our Wednesday night supper, having been fed of body. Now let's ask God to help us with God's Spirit to feed our hearts and our minds. So let us pray. Holy and mighty God, we pause to give you thanks for this incredible world and our chance to be a part of it, for the wonder of awaking this morning and realizing that we were still alive and had options of beauty and truth and goodness to experience. May we always find delight in remembering your grace, and may the sense of gratitude that is our only response to your goodness, may that cause us to trust you for the future, as your goodness and mercy have been so evident in the past. This night give me words to speak that will enable the fear in our hearts to be lessened and the hope in our hearts to be increased. May we learn from your word so that our stories will be richer and more joyful because your story has become more part of our lives. Into your hands we give these next moments of our lives, through Christ our Lord. Amen. We have been focusing this fall on a very special portion of Holy Scripture, the last 27 chapters of the prophecy of Isaiah, an Old Testament book. If you've been here before, you know that I have been repeating that this particular passage is the story of what the Hebrew people learned in a terrible, terrible time of dislocation and a time of disaster in their own lives. At the beginning of the 6th century B.C., the people who were the descendants of Abraham had the unspeakable and the absolute unexpected happen to them. And that is, an army of barbarians from Babylon swept down from the north and the east and overran Jerusalem. Most of the Jewish people either died from starvation because there was a siege laid around Jerusalem. Many were killed in battles that ensued, and those that did manage to survive, nobody's completely sure, but we think about 50,000, were deported from the land that had been promised to them and their forebear ancestor, and they was taken 600 miles to the east, and there they had to make their lives in an entirely different context. Nebuchadnezzar was the unusually violent, despotic tyrant who was at the head of this particular empire. And he had this great desire to build, and so the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that you probably heard about, one of the 7 wonders of the world, were Jewish people who were exported, were part of the workforce that made those things possible. For 60 years, the descendants of Abraham had to remember that their beloved city of David had been completely leveled, no human life left, animals, wild animals, walking through the ruins. And here they were, way away from home, from all the things that they held dear. It was a tremendously traumatic experience, which is why I have given the overall theme to this study, when the bottom drops out, what then? Because here is a story of the worst that people could conceive happening, having occurred, and the lessons that were learned in this dark and difficult period are the treasures that this 27 chapters in the last part of Isaiah give to us. One of the beautiful metaphors in the book is treasures of the darkness. That is, things of value that are found in strange and unexpected places. And if you've been here, I'm not going to take a great deal of time to catch up, but if you've been here, we have been noting several of the treasures of the darkness that did come to those people in that 60 years of exile. Now, sometime when people are in the hospital, I will tell them that they're living out the famous line from the 23rd Psalm, He maketh me lie down. To have to be inactive, to be forced out of the familiar, is often a time of great learning. Now, you can't force-feed wisdom, but many times when life does fall apart in its familiarity, it's in those times that we're broken open to learn new things. And that's what this 27 chapter passage gives to us. It's what the Hebrews learned at the bottom of their deepest disaster. And I offer this as a resource because either you have had, or you're in the midst of, or you're going to have times in your life when great difficulty comes. And to know that you're not alone, that you're not abnormal, and to know some of the resources that are available, it seems like to me that's a very, very important thing. What are some of the lessons that the Hebrews learned in that 60-year period of He maketh me lie down, when they had no political power, that they had very little control over their lives? Well, one of the lessons they learned was to reflect on their own experience and to realize that this being taken over by these barbarians was not just a random and arbitrary accident. It hadn't just happened out of the blue. It was the result of centuries of choices that they had made that had so weakened the fabric of their corporate life that they really were no match when some kind of external force came. So in the 60 years that they were in exile, the Hebrews lived into the fact that loveless living leads to destruction. You see, they had been given a vision of how to live together as a community, to care for each other, to look out for the welfare of each other, and they had not lived that way. They had not lived according to the law of love. And I've been making the point again and again in these Wednesday nights that the law of love is just exactly like the law of gravity. It is the way God has put reality together. And just as you don't break the law of gravity, but the law of gravity breaks you if you abuse it and ignore it, so I promise you, love is the central structure of reality. And to live loveless lives that can be expressed in abuse, where you take your power and exploit and deface and hurt somebody, or it can take the form of neglect. You simply don't care, look on people as if they were made of plate glass. Either one of those extreme positions of loveliness is going to weaken the social fabric. It's not going to bring you satisfaction, and it's going to make your whole society very, very vulnerable to any kind of external threat. And so as they lived through their memories, how on earth could this have happened to us? It began to break through to them that what was happening to them when a loveless tyrant came in and toppled their loveless community, that what they began to realize was we played a part in the destruction that we've experienced. This was not just something that happened to us. This was not random. This was not arbitrary. Because I want to reiterate, and we'll say it again and again, that the law of love is the law of reality. And what that means is that all sins are finally sins against love. Either sins of abuse or sins of indifference. But all sins at bottom are a sin against love. They are not using the power we've been given in the way that this one who is love, creation comes out of a mystery that is of the essence of love. It's using our power not the way our Creator meant for it to use it. So loveless living leads to destruction. The law of love is just as much operative in our lives as the law of gravity. A second treasure of the darkness that we have noted as we made our way thus far was an incredible word of good news that quite unexpectedly broke into the lives of these people who had been chastened by their experience in the furnace of exile. Taken far from home, they saw in that culture what lovelessness was like. They realized that they had been that way mostly to each other, and that's why they had fallen down. And so after 60 years of living into their own responsibility and breaking out of denial and breaking out of blaming, which are the two things we usually put up between us and the unpleasant, suddenly an unnamed prophet, about 540 BC, some 60 years after they had been taken into exile, an unnamed prophet began to speak to them with incredible power. And the word he brought to them was absolutely astonishing. And that was that this God who had first made covenant with their ancestor Abraham, this God who had been their God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the one that they believed was the mystery behind all reality, what this prophet said to them was that even though they had turned their back on this God of love, the God of love had not turned his back on them. That even though they had ignored this God and lived in ways that were utterly contrary to the way this one wanted them to live, that though they had broken the laws of God and broken the heart of God as a wayward child breaks the heart of a parent, what they had not broken was this indestructible desire to love and to bless that is at the very heart of this mystery that stands behind all reality. Now this was an incredible word that as they first lived into the fact we have brought this on ourselves, we have made our bed and now we're having to live in it, there begins to come after 60 years of being purified, 60 years of being humble, there comes this word that Yahweh, the great God of Abraham, has not turned his back on his chosen people. He has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned you, but this God still cares for you out of everlasting mercy. Now, that if you think about it, I know we've heard it so often, we who've lived in the Christian context. If you think about it, this is an incredible, incredible assertion that after all we have done violently to God's creation, that God would still have in God's heart the desire to bless us and the desire to do something for us. It has been said that Jesus' parable of the prodigal son is the gospel in miniature. It seems to sum up like a prism the essence of the Christian vision of reality. And you remember in that story that the younger son was absolutely loveless in his relationship to his father. He did absolutely the opposite of what the father had done with his life. And so he winds up as different from the father as possible. The father is loving and kind and affluent. This wayward son who is in rebellion against his father winds up in a pig pen with nothing, no friends, in a far country. He is as far from what his father had wanted him to be when he brought him into the world as you could possibly imagine. And the prodigal lived in that suffering to how he had brought this on himself, how he had brought all of this pain into his life because of his lovelessness. And so he goes back home and he says, I realize now what I didn't know then, but I have sinned against you, I've sinned against heaven. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I have blown it. I absolutely realize that all my suffering comes in the way that I've chosen to live my life. And what he discovered to his utter amazement is that all that he had done that was contrary to the Father's will had not broken the Father's hold or the Father's affection on him. Because he says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And yet what does the Father do? You know the story as well as I. The Father begins to give him the things that bespoke sonship. And then he said, this my son was dead and is alive. This my son was lost and is found. Let's have a celebration. Here is this incredible affirmation that the love of God is indestructible. That the way we relate to God has everything to do with how God is, and we who did not create our relationship to God cannot destroy it by what we do or fail to do. God's hold on us comes out of God's heart. It's not something we earn, and therefore it's not something that we can absolutely obliterate. And so here, after 60 years of living in the darkness and the drabness of the far country, a prophet arises and says, the God who created you still loves you in spite of everything. And therefore this one is going to do things for you not because you deserve it, but because that is the nature of this mystery, who is at heart everlasting mercy. One of the great dangers we in the Christian church face is that we begin to take for granted what, if you heard it for the first time, would be incredible, incredible surprise. There was a great preacher back in 19th century England called Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He had a very effective 50-year ministry at a place called the Tabernacle in London. And toward the end of his life, someone was saying, how has Spurgeon stayed so incredibly vital? What is the secret of his power? And someone who was very astute said, Spurgeon never got over being astonished by the gospel. Never got over being absolutely aghast at the kind of mercy that would give life and then find that life violated as tragically as we have violated God's gifts, and continue to love us in the face of our unlovingness. We turn our backs on him. He doesn't turn his back on us. We forget him and destroy his creation. He does not forget us and turn to destruction. And so the word that came, the second treasure of the darkness in this wonderful, wonderful book, is that prophet who began by saying, comfort ye my people, and then told them what they could have never believed on their own, and that was that God still had some positive concern for them after all that they had done to God. And this is a treasure in the darkness that I pray we will never take for granted. God did not have to be love. God did not have to have everlasting mercy. There's nothing that we have done that makes the heart of the holy to be the merciful reality that it is. That God is what God is incredible and astonishing good fortune. And to always be amazed at that grace is to be true to the Christian vision. And so the second treasure of the darkness is this word that began to come through this prophet, that God has not given up on you. He then began to announce that because of that, two things were going to happen very shortly that were the outgrowth of God's not having given up. The first is that the Hebrews were going to be allowed to return back to Palestine. Realize now their city had been decimated. The Babylonians had absolutely swept the Mediterranean basin. But now this prophet said, you are going to be able to return from that place from which you were very forcefully extracted. You're going to be able to go back. And we've talked in prior lessons that the instrument of their being able to go back to Israel was a Persian leader that most of these Hebrews had never heard of. He was a brilliant, brilliant man named Cyrus. He grew up in Persia. He united the Medes and the Persians, which were a group to the east of Babylon. He had incredible military sagacity. He was a person who knew how to move people and inspire them, his own armies. He knew how to use situations very skillfully. He would let the internal discord of a country get to such a boiling point that then it wasn't hard to conquer. And so Cyrus did what Nebuchadnezzar was never able to do. He was able to bring his control over all of what we know today as Iran and Iraq and Syria, even what is far to the west is Greece. He absolutely united the ancient world as it had never been united before. And he was a man who had himself off his hands. He wasn't extractive and hostile like Nebuchadnezzar. And so when he took over Babylon in 536, the first thing he did was to say, all of you people who've been brought here against your will, I'm going to let you go back to your homes. I'm going to let you live the way you would like to live. He was a merciful and a beneficent liberator. Now Cyrus was to the Hebrews pure and sheer grace. They had had nothing to do with creating him. In fact, it was hard for some of the Hebrews to believe that they were going to be liberated by someone who was not of their own race, that God was going to use someone other than the chosen people to do his will. But you remember I said to you that throughout the book, Cyrus is referred to as the instrument of God. That is, he served God's purposes Not because he was all that aware of them, but because he had the kind of character that he had developed, and God was able to use him in order to set the people free. Cyrus is a symbol of incredible grace. There was not a thing on earth the Hebrews could be proud of in Cyrus doing what Cyrus did. It was a gift that was given to them exactly like their birth. And I tried to make the point as I talked about Cyrus that what this says to us is that God is capable of using absolutely everything. That God doesn't have to have our total awareness in order to be able to use us. In fact, awareness is by no means the full measure of reality. I would have you realize that there's more going on at this moment than any of us realize. There are depths of the mystery of God's action beneath us, around us, above us, within us. God is infinitely bigger than our particular awareness, and God is the ultimate alchemist. The alchemist was able to take lead and find a way to turn it into gold, take something that looked for all the world like one thing, and lo and behold, bring something else out of it. And that is the image of God that they begin to see as they watched how Cyrus came in and set the Israelites free and let them go back to Palestine. Here was the astonishing assertion that this Creator God, who stands behind everything, is capable of using any kind of means, lots of keys on God's keyboard, not just the traditional and the conventional ones. And so Cyrus invites us, as one of my commentator friends says, to live above sea level, S-E-E, to realize there's a depth of mystery to the life that we're living at this moment. We don't begin to fathom all the things that are at work. And so the first thing that this prophet announces is that you are going to be able to return, and it's going to be as much a gift of grace to you as your own birth. The other thing he said to them was that you, when you go back to Palestine, you are going to have a chance to recover the original calling that God had first given to Abraham. You are going to go back as a purified and as a humbled and chastened people, and God is going to call you again to pick up the vocation that was first given to Abraham, and you are going to become a priestly people and not the military leaders that you had wanted to be. And one of the signs of this is that when the Hebrews did go back, they began to build the city. They loved Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple, but they never did rebuild David's palace. They never became a political entity anymore. They never had a king like other countries. They never focused on trying to dominate other countries the way Nebuchadnezzar had done, the way Cyrus had done. They at least learned the lesson that their calling in history was to be a witness to God's nature. Their calling was not to dominate, but their calling was to bless. And as the unknown prophet talks about how you are going to have a chance to recover your original vocation, he comes up with a brand new image as far as the Hebrews are concerned. None of the prophets had ever talked about this. But as a way of describing what it is that God had meant for the descendants of Abraham to be and what it is that they were to do, he gives the image of the servant of the Lord, which is probably the single most important thing that the Hebrews learned when the bottom dropped out and when the worst that possibly could happen did happen. They had lifted before them an ideal of how they could collaborate with God, how God was going to do what God wanted to do. And there are 4 specific passages in these 27 chapters that are called the servant songs. The most famous is the last one, the suffering servant. He was bruised for our iniquities. He suffered all of the sins that resulted from our sin. But there are 4 servant songs in the prophecy of Isaiah that give us this wonderful, wonderful way of understanding what it is that Israel was called to do, because of what it is that was given to Abraham. And in these next 3 weeks, we're going to take these separate servant songs and going to look at them, because that by actual count, there are 18 different qualities, 18 specific qualities of what the servant of the Lord is going to be like. And why this is so important, is that this gives us a vision of how God wants us to live our lives. And the other reason that it's so important, that historically, this is how God is going to go about saving the world through the work of the servant. And what makes this so special is that historically, this image of the servant, which we'll be studying about for the next 3 weeks, was not fully embodied or not completely fulfilled until 500 years after this particular time that we're studying. Because as you already know, I trust, it was this image of the suffering servant in this part of Isaiah that Jesus took as his model for his vocation. There's a sense in which what God first wanted Abraham and his descendants to do, what was first given to Abraham and his people, is something that finally was brought to perfect fulfillment, because Jesus took these servant poems that we're going to be studying. He grew up in a part of Israel where there was great piousness and great sensitivity to human tradition. He took these four servant songs, and they became his model for how he lived his life and how he accomplished his purpose. The servant is the way that God intends to do his work in the world. It is what Jesus used to shape his life. It becomes the model of what we ourselves are to do with our life. And so I guess the loveliest treasure of the darkness that we can say came to the Hebrew people is that in this time of exile, and after they had been through what they'd been through, there arose one who said, "Let me show you a picture of what God is going to do to redeem you and what God is going to call you to become." And so here became the vision that shaped the life of Jesus. It was 500 years after this was first articulated that it became flesh and dwelt among us, and Jesus did accomplish that work. Now the whole nation originally was called to this vocation of servanthood. Going all the way back to the 12th chapter of Genesis, suddenly a God named Yahweh comes to a man named Abraham and shocks him to death by saying, "Abraham, I, the Lord God of the universe, I want to bless you." This is the very essence of the nature of God. It is who I am to want to bless. That's all there is to God, God's inherent desire to bless. Now, these words came as an absolute shock to Abraham, because Abraham was a part of that ancient culture that had let get itself embedded in the notion that instead of God being one who wants to bless, they had the mistaken notion that somehow the gods were selfish, somehow the gods did not care about humanity, somehow those who inhabited the heavens had nothing but disdain and contempt for the creatures that were here on earth. And so because they had erroneously assumed that God was against them and not for them, they had developed this profound sense of mistrust that led them not to live life the way God asked them to live, but they took life into their hands, they were scared to death of everything, and they began to take life apart and put it together in loveless ways that God had never intended. The serpent had planted the seed in the first forebears that instead of being the generous one that you could trust, instead of seeing creation as God saying, "Look, I want to share my kind of joy with you, so I've created the world and I want you to live the way I live so you can taste my joy," instead of seeing the Creator as the generous one, the serpent suggested that the Creator was the selfish one. He said he's trying to exploit you, he's trying to make a fool out of you, He doesn't care anything about you. He's trying to extract things from you. You cannot trust this one. Don't listen to what he says about how you live in the world. Don't listen to all this business about you can eat of these trees, but you can't eat of that tree. There's not love behind reality. There's selfishness and there's cruelty. And so humanity, in the biblical understanding of things, got off on this incredible wrong track, because instead of seeing the face of God as a face of generosity and love, they began to image God as cruelty, as indifference, as a manipulator. And if that's what you think you're up against, then of course you're not going to trust. Of course you're not going to obey. You're going to live your life in fear, and fear is the opposite of love, because fear is self-concern. Fear has no interest in anybody else but self. And so here you have fear, and here you have love, the two polar opposites. And so here was the problem that Abraham's experience brought to this encounter. And so he was shocked. He was shocked to hear the Divine One saying, I want to bless. This is my nature. This is what I want you to do. And to be a witness to God's nature to bless, and to show the world what it would be like if you believed that and trusted in that God, that was the vocation that was given to Abraham and to his descendants. They were to see in the face of God the face of goodness, and they were to live life on those terms. Several years ago, I was asked to give the Lyman Beecher lectures on preaching at the Yale Divinity School back in 1979, and I used as a kind of centerpiece of what I tried to say in those lectures a story that I have told many times. I've told it in this room before, but maybe it'll help you sense what this call to Abraham, what it involved, and the problem that stands in the background. The story was that a merchant out in the Midwest, back in the turn of the century, had twin sons, identical twin sons, born to him. And the two boys looked exactly alike, had much the same temperament. As they were raised, they were dressed alike, they did all the same things. They seemed almost like they were one person in two bodies. When they went to college, they roomed with each other. And they found their relationship to each other so satisfying and so creative that neither ever married. They came back from college and went in business with their father in the merchant business that he had. And when he got too old to work, they took over the business, and when he died, they continued to run the business as a partnership. And for years, they were looked on as just the model of a reciprocal and creative relationship. People marveled at how wonderfully they got along and how they supported each other. Well, early one morning, a customer came in the store, nobody else had been in, and made $1 purchase from one of the brothers because it was a small town, and the cash register had not been opened. The brother just left the $1 bill on the top of the register and walked to the front door visiting with his neighbor. And a few minutes later, he remembered what he'd done, came back and found the $1 bill gone. And so he said to his twin, did you see the $1 bill that was here on the cash register? I remember making the sale, but the cash register was not unlocked, and so I just left it on top. And the twin said, I didn't see $1. I don't know what you're talking about. And the other twin said, that's strange. I vividly remember doing that, and nobody else has been in here since then but us. I wonder what happened to it. And the other twin said, I really don't know. If it had been allowed to be dropped, it's just one of those minor mysteries, nothing would have come of it. But the first twin could not let it go. And for the first time in all their life together, the shadow of suspicion began to fall between them. Because an hour later, the first twin said, are you sure you didn't see that $1? And the other twin picked up the hint of suspicion, the accusation that was implicit, and he said, I told you I didn't see the $1. Are you accusing me of being dishonest? And that was the beginning of a beautiful relationship beginning to fall apart. As they tried to get at this, other suspicions began to be gathered. It got to the place that they couldn't even talk together civilly. Every time they talked, the old suspicion, the old angers, the old mistrust began to surface. And it finally got so bad that they dissolved their partnership. They ran a petition down through the center of the store, and what had once been a productive partnership became a savage competition. Each twin trying to go out in the community and get people to side with him against the other. And for 20 years, this was a running sore that hurt everybody in the community. Well, one day, a car with an out-of-state license pulled up in front of one of the stores. And a well-dressed businessman got out and went into one of the sides and asked the proprietor, "How long have you been in business here?" And he said, "Well, my father has been here, and I've been in business here for 75 years. He said, "Then you're the one with whom I have to settle an old score." He said, 20 years ago, I was out of work. I was riding from town to town in freight cars. I didn't have any money. I was really on hard times. And he said, I got off the train in your town early one morning, and I was walking down the back alley. He said, I hadn't had anything to eat for 3 days. And though I had been raised to know that it was wrong to steal, I looked through the back door, and there was a $1 bill on the cash register, and everybody else was up in the front of the store. And he said, I slipped in and stole that $1 bill and went and bought myself some breakfast. And he said, that has burned my conscience ever since. And I decided I would never have any peace until I came back and made amends. So I'm here not only to repay you for what I stole, but also to pay you for the damages. And he was unprepared that his story reduced the old man in front of him to absolute tears. And when the old man finally got his composure, he said, would you be willing to go next door and repeat the story you just told? So he went outside, went around the petition, went in the store, and he repeated the same story to a man who looked remarkably like the first. And when he finished, it was not one old man, but 2 old men, crying as if their hearts would break, because suddenly it came clear that an erroneous perception as to what had happened had led to mistrust, and mistrust had led to the unmaking of everything that was creative. To think 20 years of recrimination, 20 years of hostility, all based on a misapprehension of a single event. It was the birth of mistrust on mistaken evidence that had led to the destruction that community had lived through for 20 years. Now, I use that story to suggest that this is a parable of what happened to our creation, that the minute creatures began to mistrust God and to think that there was something to suspect behind the Holy One, then that led them to all kinds of fearful, destructive actions. That led to the unmaking of creation, which is what evil really is. And it was to answer this problem of mistrust that God decided to start all over again. And with Abraham, he enters the scene and says, look, you've had it all wrong from the very beginning. I am one who wants to bless. It is safe to trust me. It is safe to obey me. And beginning with Abraham and his descendants, God began to try to counter the terrible, terrible destruction that had come from the primal mistrust that is at the heart of our human sinfulness. And so the salvation story, as some people have called it, is God's answer to a bad reputation. That is what God did to counter this deep-seated suspicion that got rooted deep, deep into the human race. And so the original covenant with Abraham was that I want you, first of all, to believe that when you look in my face, you're looking in the face of someone who is generous, someone who is good. And then I want you to bear witness to the world of what it is like to believe in that kind of God and to live your life trustingly, obediently, and lovingly. That was the vocation that was originally given to Abraham and his descendants. I will give you a land to call your own, this God said. I'll give you descendants. I'll give you a name that will renown, and I want through you to bless all the families of the earth. God started to unscramble the terrible, terrible results of mistrust beginning in the 12th chapter of Genesis, the salvation story of showing to the world who God is really like, and therefore displacing the mistrust that leads to evil and restoring that sense of trust that is the essence of how we were meant to live in this world. Now, how does that work get accomplished? How is trust restored? How do we get back into the place that we really do look into the face of God and see something good and are able to trust and able to obey? Well, the image of the servant is this prophet's description of how God is going to go ahead and complete this task of restoring us back to a trusting relationship. When you're talking about trust and mistrust, sheer power is ineffective. You don't strong-arm a mistrusting person and make that one into a trusting person. Sheer power is really ineffective when it comes to this. Somehow, you have to show the mistrustful person that they've been mistaken all along in their negative assumptions about you. Somehow you've got to break through to them that you do love them and that you do have the desire to help, and that this is your true nature. It is the gift of giving someone love and continuing to give it that is the most potent, effective way of taking the mistrust that leads to evil and restoring the trust that makes for goodness. And the image of the servant, the image of one who came into the world, obedient to the vision that God is a God of goodness, and determined to stay loving no matter what the world does to him. That is the way that God accomplishes this primordial task of taking our fears and our mistrust and turning that into something that is truly healthy and truly trusting. I think Jesus was right on the point when he realized that in the image of the servant, he had the way, literally. Well, mistrust is the sin of the world. It's the sin that gives rise to all particular kinds of sins. And how do you rid the world of mistrust? How do you rid the world of lovelessness and destructiveness and all these things that are so terribly, terribly antithetical to God? Well, you do it like the servant did it, by first coming and living among us, identifying with all of the world as it exists. You step into the furnace of hostility, the way Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were cast into that fire, and lo and behold, as Nebuchadnezzar looked, there was a fourth presence in there with them, which is a prefiguring of Christ. The servant identifies fully with people in all of their agony. He comes to them where they are. I remember back in the 60s, I was trying to make that point once, and I translated John 3:16. God so loved the world that he allowed his son to be bussed into this ghetto called earth, because at that time the whole idea of letting a child be bussed into a dangerous neighborhood was antithetical to what most people were thinking, that God would love us enough to send one into the very midst of our destructiveness, to identify at its lowest and most destructive way with what we are, and then in that powerful in the midst of us, to remain loving and to remain one who wants to bless no matter what is done to him. The suffering servant was one who absorbed evil without returning evil back. He took what destructiveness gave him in all of its awfulness and gave back love. And I have said this 1,000 times, and I'll say it again. If there's any way of ridding the world of evil, that's the most effective way. If someone comes up and acts destructively to me, and I respond in kind, which is my first impulse, all I do is add to the quantity of evil that is there. I multiply evil by imitating the very things that I abhor. But if somebody comes up and acts destructively toward me, and I absorb that and I give back non-violent love, if I return good for evil, if I give them back something different than what they gave to me, at least I haven't added to the quantity of evil, and I just may, in that asymmetrical response, I may have offered that destructive person a new vision of how they can use their power and therefore at least open the possibility that they can redirect their energies. Now, we humans are free. There is no fail-safe strategy here. But of all the things that have the power of taking evil and transmuting it into goodness, of taking the destructive and turning it into something creative, of all the things that have the promise of doing that, I would say that the model of the suffering servant, you absorb evil and you give back goodness, that has the greatest potential to rid this world of the destructiveness that is all our pain and undoing. It is the most potent possibility. There's nothing fail-safe. There's nothing to guarantee that if you return good for evil, that the evildoer is going to be transformed. But I can say to you, whereas it is a possibility that that might happen, if you choose to respond like the suffering servant, if you simply return evil for evil, if you answer fire with fire, if you give somebody back a dose of their own medicine, I know that's not going to change them. It is simply going to add to the problem. Therefore, Jesus found in this wonderful treasure in the Isaiah darkness, he found the vision of what he felt called to do. God had sent him into the world with the same mission that had been given to Abraham. I want to bless, and through you, I want to bless everybody. Jesus found in the image of the suffering servant, he found the way to do that at incredible cost to himself, but at incredible benefit for the rest of us. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we were healed. That's what the image of the servant offers as the hope of the world. And I would suggest to you that if we really want to live into the essence of the Christian vision, that God is one who wants to bless and not to destroy, and if we want to be a part of that, if we want to join forces with that God who wants to bless everybody, then the pattern of suffering love, the pattern of taking evil and absorbing it rather than imitating it, and giving back something different than what was given to us, of all the things we could do redemptively, that is the most powerful. One of my favorites, in fact, I wish tonight that I could get it. We had time to look at it because it makes the main point I want to make in closing about suffering servants so vivid. I've referred to it before. It's an old black and white movie called Stars in My Crown, based on a book that was written by a very gifted author, which was really retelling the story of what it was like when he was a 12-year-old boy to go and visit his grandfather, who was an old, rough-and-tumble Methodist circuit rider, back in the West when it was a lawless territory and life was really, really hard. Well, in this story and in one of the scenes of the movie, he tells about an old black man in the community that had lived his whole life there. He was a kind of Uncle Remus figure, beloved by all the children, told them wonderful stories, taught them to hunt, taught them to fish. Everybody loved this old gentleman. And it so happened that he had been able to buy a tiny little piece of land where he had a little hut on it. And they discovered a rich vein of copper that happened to run right under the land that the old black man owned. And some of the progressive people in the community wanted to start a mining operation. There was nothing wrong with that. And so in order to do that, they had to buy up the land. And so they went to the old black man and offered him a really fine price for his property, telling him what he wanted to do with it. Well, he didn't live in a money culture. He didn't really understand what it was. He wanted to live out the rest of his life on that piece of land that he'd always known. And so in great innocence, he refused to sell. Well, this frustrated the economic prospects of the community. And when money is involved, people can get nasty, as you know quite well. And so when they couldn't buy him out, and when they couldn't figure out any way to get the land, and they so wanted to start this anyway, they decided to resort to intimidation, to scare the old man off the property. So as sun was going down, they would ride through his land and shoot guns in the air. And when they weren't able to scare him off, finally they resorted to the ultimate intimidation. They tacked a notice on his door one night that if he was not off that property by sundown the next day, they were going to come in their Ku Klux Klan's robe and they were going to hang the old man. And he got the message that his life was in fact in real peril. Well, as the story unfolds, the old Methodist preacher, white man, found out what was happening, went out to the old black man's house that day. And so the climactic scene of this particular portion happens as the sun's going down. And here come the white night riders, the men in their cowardly white robes, riding up with a noose very ominously visible. And when they ride up in the yard, the old black man dressed in his Sunday best steps out on the porch, and the old Methodist preacher is alongside him. The Methodist preacher says, "My friend here knows that you've come to kill him. He knows that's what you're going to do. And so he asked me to come out today and to write out his last will and testament. He wants me to read it to you before you hang him." He takes out this piece of paper and he said he wants to give the land to the banker because he seems to want it so badly. He wants to give his rifle to Tom because he remembers the first time he killed a squirrel with it. He wants to give his fishing pole to Dick because he remembers the first little perch that he bought. And the old man proceeded to give generously every meager possession he had to the very people who were standing out there ready to take his life in order to get his land. It was such an incredible, incredible response to something so destructive, such a returning of good for evil that it shocked those who had come on that mission of destruction. And in the movie, as they heard and saw that kind of simple goodness, absorbing evil and giving back good, one by one, to their credit, they began to turn and go away until nobody was left to hang the old man. Well, the author, the 12-year-old boy, was watching all this at a discreet distance. And when they had left and the excitement had died down, he comes bounding up on the porch in the movie and says to his grandfather with a kind of awe, "What kind of will was that, Granddaddy?" And the old man said, "The will of God, son, the will of God." Love returned in the face of evil. Love that stays loving no matter what. That is the way to take away the sin of the world. And Jesus has done it for us. Jesus has taken the worst that we could possibly give and gave back nothing but, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Gave them back nothing but sheer, unadorned goodness. And he got the model from this treasure of darkness that you find in Isaiah, and he gives us the grand privilege of joining him in taking away the sin of the world by being as irresistibly and invincibly loving, no matter what, as we possibly can. It's called taking up your cross and following Jesus. Nobody ever said it was easy, but of all the ways that we can have a good